last night.
Taking when the coach comes down the...
Are you okay to tell them about the fair?
Earlier this year? Checked into the BBC's ceremony.
Yeah.
Look at that. Is there still on the shot list?
3, 2, 1. 5 credits. 4, 3.
I'd just like to say hello to everybody and good evening, and thank you so much for joining us here tonight at this. It's a special joint Royal Television Society event this evening between the RTS Technology Centre and RTS London. The RTS Tech Centre is a new name for RTS Thames Valley, and this is our first event as the Tech Centre, which is brilliant. I'm Kim Rowell, and I'm Managing Editor of News Productions with ITN Productions, and it's been my pleasure to put this wonderful panel that you have in front of you together this evening. Tonight's topic, as we all know, is Operation Lion, broadcasting a once-in-a-nation's-lifetime event, very kindly sponsored by Timeline TV. Your moderator this evening is presenter and journalist Anila Dhami, and joining her on our illustrious panel are Head of News Productions and Archive at ITN Productions, Tami Hoffman, Deployment Editor for UK Newsgathering at the BBC, John Whitney, NBC producer, Kiko Itasaka, and Content Editor for Special Events, the Special Events team at ITV News, Tim Forrest. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Anila. Thank you.
Thanks, Kim. Good evening, everyone. I think it's quite apt that that video had no sound because it did show such key moments, and hopefully it gave you a chance to be taken back to those key moments and maybe insert yourself in those moments and reflect back to what your experience of them was. And it's such a privilege to be chairing this panel tonight, having been in a newsroom during that historic moment, though that national period of mourning, and having been able to reflect on it now, these months later, but to now hear other experiences and what it was like for others in the newsroom and those at the top who've been planning it for years, have been part of rehearsals for years, and have been part of and can reflect on, that bigger picture that we were all witness to. So I want to first of all ask how many of you were in a newsroom during that period? Okay. And how many of you watched coverage during that period? Amazing. So tonight is going to be really insightful about how what you saw on your screens was brought to you, partly because of these 4 people here. So I want to take us back to the moment it began. Thursday, the 8th of September. It's around lunchtime. I was putting a VT together. We'd all had our morning meetings, off doing our thing. And there's a slight hubbub that something's happening. And then you start to get the feeling that it's something really serious. I'm talking about that moment where we started to see in Parliament a note was being passed. Just let's begin by that moment when news started to come through that the Queen Elizabeth II is unwell but comfortable and resting in Balmoral. Where were you when you heard this news?
Well, I was in Gray's Inn Road, the ITN offices, but I was actually in a different part of the building. And I walked into the newsroom and there was a huddle of people in the middle of the newsroom. And one of them was Lizzie Robinson, our royal producer, who was looking at her phone. And as I walked past, she said, "Comfortable, that's a terrible word in palace speak." And I think just looking at her face, I kind of knew where we were with that one. And I think actually my initial feeling was one of huge relief, because my great fear had always been that I would be away from my desk when it happened, that I'd be on a plane or on holiday or ill or I don't know what. And actually being in the newsroom on a weekday with a fantastic team around me. I thought, well, if it's going to happen, it's going to happen, and this is as good a time as any.
I was at home thinking nothing's going to happen today. I had the TV on, and I went upstairs to get something, and I came back down and my phone had 7 missed calls, and I thought, oh, I think I know what this is. But I was in the office within half an hour or so, and like you were saying, things were beginning to happen, weren't they? We had a guest who was on the on one of our daily politics shows, who was a politician who was saying about what was going on at Parliament, and then like you just sort of began to see the story playing out, didn't you?
Well, I was in our offices at Austerley. NBC News is partners with the wonderful Sky. And I have to say, I think the night before I had already thought, I think this is it, because she had missed a virtual Privy Council meeting. And we'd seen her so much, especially when it was virtual meetings, she did tend to go even when she was unwell. So I went into work super early, and without even thinking about it, I had put on a black dress. And a colleague of mine, one of our correspondents, had also told me she left the house. We'd had a brief conversation. She left the house with a kind of brightly colored blouse on and turned around and got a black blazer. And turned out our instincts, I guess, our premonitions were right. She was on air all day as soon as the announcement was made, actually even before, when they talked about her, being comfortable. And so I think maybe we were all ready. We'd been ready for such a long time. But it just, you did have that feeling in the newsroom, okay, here we go.
Kiko, your sixth sense is better than mine. I started the day at home. I actually had a call with Ruth Davidson, the former Conservative leader of the Scottish Parliament, because we were trying to book her to become part of our team. And actually that was the call in which we finally got her and confirmed her. And she said to me, as we were kind of wrapping up the call, how do you sleep at night? And I said, well, I sleep fine. We've got a plan. You know, we're ready, and, you know, we're ready to go. And she said, yeah, but, you know, I was a member of the TA, and I remember that, you know, a plan's only as good as the moment that it hits reality. So I'll ask you again, how do you sleep at night? I thought, okay. And it turned out that I wasn't going to be doing any sleeping at all, basically for the next 2 weeks. But then I headed into the office, started a meeting that was nowhere near the newsroom, saw the news, and just thought, well, I better eat my lunch because it's going to be a long one. And that was the start.
And at this point, it sets off a flood of decision-making, doesn't it? What are you thinking at this point? I mean, your instincts were completely bang on. You know, what happens from this point on where you're in the newsroom and you're like, right, what gets set into motion from that point?
The video that you just saw, I'd never seen before, actually. It was put together by some of my colleagues, and some of them are here tonight. It was actually the meeting that took place when we got in. We had the news that came along before our main lunchtime bulletin, and that bulletin was being put together at speed, so it was reactive to what the news was. But after that, it became very clear that we needed to get ready for an announcement and also be ready for a non-announcement as well. So it was absolutely very much new, the plans beginning to kick in, but also the knowledge that you didn't want to go too soon here. You didn't want to be putting out the wrong kind of message, I suppose. The words, though the Queen was comfortable, was what we'd been given. Our job is still to report what we have in front of us.
We just thought that statement was so significant about the health. We just, as we have a 24-hour news channel on all the time, so we just kept going at that point because it's so unique to get a statement like that. And I think that framed the rest of the day, didn't it? Mm.
I think in our case, we basically realized we have to be ready to go on the air officially the moment it is officially announced. So that entailed having somebody in our Austerley studios in front of the camera with her black blazer on, getting somebody to Canada Gate in case. So just positioning people. And when you're an American network, you also have to have this consideration. You want to let people in New York know. You do let people in New York know, but you also don't want to set off a big scare. You don't want people to be reporting things that haven't been officially announced yet. And also, though, you have to think about how many people are going to come over, how are we going to get them over. All those logistics also start to fall into place, but you can't actually do it until the announcement is made.
Yeah, I mean, I draw a distinction between how you start to react operationally and how you start to react from a sort of presentation position. I think operationally, we started moving. We got people on planes up to Scotland. We started calling in freelancers. We reached out to, our satellite truck providers. I think the worst you would have done was chucked a bit of money at it and been wrong. But I think that was a much better thing to do than sitting twiddling your thumbs thinking, should we press go? I think from the presentation side, there are no prizes for being first and wrong with a story like this. And I think caution was absolutely the name of the game. But operationally, I think we did start getting things moving pretty quickly.
And there is that thing of breaking news, isn't there? John, you say that the news was rolling at this point and you just stayed on air. Was there that desire to be first?
No, there really wasn't. The desire was to be right, and we were right. We were already on air, of course, with the Daily Politics show and other programmes that were already on doing coverage of what was happening at the time. So no, there really wasn't any pressure to be first. It would just be right and slow and just think it all through. But like Tami was saying, the key thing is you're doing a lot of stuff off air. You're doing a lot of deployments. You're making sure you're in the right places, which I'm really glad we did at the right time.
Yeah, and that's a real nod to the fact that this takes years and years and years of planning, doesn't it? Which I want to come to, and the operational side, the logistics of planning. But I also want to talk very quickly about the fact the news agenda may have changed on the day. So what do you then decide? How do you decide that actually we're just going to roll on this, and it may not be the death of the Queen, but we're going to roll on it and throw all the rest of the news out?
Well, I think it's particularly complicated for an American audience and an American network to make that decision because despite the fact that most Americans do believe that the royal family is theirs, I think the reality is that it is the British royal family. And so were there another major news story going on in the US on that day, I think we would have had a mixture. But as it turns out, there wasn't that much on the news agenda, so it wasn't an issue. It's actually interesting because you had sent these questions, thank you, in advance. And I did start to think, what would have knocked it off the air? Or what would have changed? What story would we have done? Maybe a huge weather story, an earthquake in another country. But basically, this was the big story, and we all knew once it happened, this was all we were going to do for 10 to 12 days.
I think that's fair. I think it's even more straightforward from a UK broadcaster's perspective. You play the hand you're dealt in news. It's so what's the next story along, and how does that compare up against the story that you've got? And there wasn't another story. So it wasn't really a conversation that day.
So as events unfold, the Queen's extended family making their way to Balmoral. We know that this is looking really serious. What are the next steps? Because you're still balancing that, aren't you, between getting everything and everyone in place, having those meetings, but the news still hasn't broken. So what are you doing there? What's happening in the meetings? Give us an insight into the chats you're having.
Well, I think the first chat I had was with my family to say goodbye. And to warn them I wouldn't be around for a while. I think, first of all, there's a lot of reassurance that you want to be giving all around. I mean, certainly sort of when you get a big story like this, people can get a little bit rabbit in the headlights. And I think giving reassurance to your team that, we've got this, you've got this, you're going to be fine. Just stick with the plan. I think reaching out to partners, to freelancers, to everyone, and just giving that reassurance. I think at that stage in the game, it's about holding your nerve. What you don't want is stress coming down the line. You don't want with partners, Berlin shouting at the London office who then start shouting at you what's happening. You want to send reassurance up the chain rather than stress coming down it. And I think, it's impossible to know what was going on that day because the operation was so big, and the key to it was the fact that it had all been delegated out. I mean, Tim was talking about that meeting, and when we talked about it earlier, there weren't loads of questions. It wasn't people saying, what do I do, what do I do? People knew what their jobs was, and I think from a sort of management point of view, it was calming nerves and saying, go, print out your notes, get your head together, make the calls, clear your diaries, be ready to go on this.
I really agree with you about you want to give an image to the office that you're calm, so the other people are calm around you. And I think on the whole that really did happen, which I think is really good.
Were you calm?
There's other stories which I found much more stressful than that one in a way, because we knew what to do. As you rightly said, you just got to make sure people know what they're doing, that they've got clear instruction about what they're doing, liaising with other people, like people, for example, in BBC Scotland, because obviously Aberdeen was a major focus, wasn't it, of the story when it happened. And a lot of people were quite calm and just they knew what they're doing, so just got on with it.
I think it was also an unusual situation in that we knew what the plans were. We knew about them for many, many years in advance. So we knew what the schedule would be, what the protocol would be, but we never had a date. So that was the kind of wild card of it. But at least we did have plans in place. From my point of view, it was just really important to make sure that everybody got all of the briefing books that we had prepared. Again, a lot of American reporters have familiarity with the story. Maybe some of it was from the TV series The Crown. You wanted to be very careful that the information that they had was absolutely accurate. And we spent a lot of time making briefing books, but not Bibles. They had to be, short enough so that people could read it on a plane ride over from the United States and absorb the information. So making sure that we distributed that to the right people very quickly, making sure that we had our obit ready to go, making sure that we had all of our related features ready to go. A lot of that takes, we knew to do it, but when you actually have to do it, you think, okay, here we go. We really do have to get this process going.
There were many things that fell in our favour that were not in our control. This happened just after the summer holidays. Largely, people were back. It happened during a period where there wasn't a massive foreign deployment. Largely, everybody was in place and ready. And so on top of everything that you've talked about having that confidence, I felt we were going into this in the right place, happening in the middle of a week as well. It fell in our favour, and that confidence only grew, really.
And having 6 hours.
Yeah.
Although I am curious, I did think to myself, oh, Balmoral, uh-oh, and wonder how you all felt about that.
I was pleased because I'd spent loads of time on the Scotland plan, and it was going to come off.
Our colleagues at BBC Scotland were excellent. They all had a plan. I just want to reiterate your weekday point as well. I think that is a major factor, the fact that it's a weekday. So we had a full staff in the office. It wasn't 7 o'clock in the morning on a Saturday morning. We had a staff that were ready and good to go and work on other stories that are much easier to move people around than it is getting them from scratch on a Saturday morning.
Yeah, and I really wouldn't underestimate the fact that we really did have a few hours to get our own heads together on it. I think it wasn't the JFK moment of where were you when you heard the news, because actually we had a few hours to absorb it. And when the news was actually announced, it was a really strange sense of calm, of people just, the newsroom went very, very quiet as everyone watched the screens.
Well, I'm going to talk about this now, because at 6:30 on Thursday, the 8th of September, it was publicly announced that Queen Elizabeth II had died at 3:10 p.m. So Britain's longest reigning monarch and Queen of the UK and Commonwealth had died at the age of 96 at Balmoral Castle in Scotland. It was a historic moment, and the eyes of the world were focused on Balmoral, and they were absorbing the news. Tell us how you felt at that moment when that news broke on air.
Responsible, because we want to get it right. But interesting to hear what you're saying as well, Tami, because I felt the same, that our office was really quiet. You could hear a pin drop at the time. It was very quiet, it was very dignified, because I think the atmosphere outside in the newsroom can then represent the way it is on air as well. So I think that's a really important point about us, just all being calm, and it was very dignified and very quiet, no shouting around or screaming. It was all very organised, actually.
I think our office was similarly quiet. And I think even though we knew and we had hours to prepare, I still personally felt slightly shocked, like, oh, did this really happen? And I thought, oh, do I want to cry? I kind of want to cry. Oh, I don't have time to cry. Many breaking news stories, you do have people running around shouting, waving their arms. It seems to be part of kind of newsroom decorum to do that when there is a breaking news story. It's part of coverage. But in this instance, as I think everybody has said, it was calm, reflective, quiet, and everybody just said, okay, here we go.
But it was really big. I mean, it was really big. You know, I had the editor on my left shoulder. I had the head of output just over further. I think everybody was crowded round my screen, which was looking at Twitter, and a deputy program editor's screen, which was looking at the royal family's website. And we were just pressing refresh and refresh and refresh. And everybody thought it was going to come on the royal website, and it came on Twitter. I've heard someone at Sky saying that it's the first time she's ever stood at the back of a gallery and said, it's on Twitter, break it. But it's where it dropped. It's where it landed.
And I suppose, although you've all described it being calm and quiet, what is it like to shoulder that responsibility? Because it is historic, that moment. When people, generations, are watching back, they'll be watching that moment covered on the news.
Look, you get into news to work in big stories, you know, so you want to stand up at those moments, but obviously it's incredibly important that you recognise what you're doing, that you're other people's eyes and ears to a certain degree. You work with that every day. This just happened to be a really, really big day, and we wanted to get it right.
I think I and many of my colleagues in London also, we really did feel an extraordinary amount of responsibility to make sure that our American colleagues got everything right as well. You know, they weren't, for obvious reasons, as steeped in the history. They didn't grow up learning about the royal family. They don't necessarily know, which buildings are what, or, why it would take place at Westminster, why the funeral would take place at Westminster Abbey. They wouldn't necessarily know where the processional route was. Little things like, when they see the word M-A-L-L spelt, they say mall. And we have to say, we want them to get that right. So I think for us, our briefing books and having conversations with everybody, making sure that we had the right producers with correspondents who had flown in from overseas. Look, everybody had done their homework, and I think everybody did very well, but you just wanted to make sure you got it right.
Your mind moves quite quickly on once the announcement came to the events that are happening soon, like Prime Minister reaction, the moving moment of the flags in Buckingham Palace, all the other events that happened quite quickly. I thought very moving was the shots of people just gathering around Buckingham Palace, wasn't it? Yeah. Just being quiet and gathering. So quite quickly then moving into thinking about what you can do next. So it wasn't too much time at the time to reflect, really, was it? Because there's so much about to happen.
Yeah, I mean, I'm afraid my thoughts were far more prosaic. I was just thinking, is this D? Is this D because it's happened quite late in the day? Or actually, we're going to be D-1, because obviously you're starting to timetable out. And that was the really critical thing, that to actually put the plan in action, we needed to know where we were in the plan. So, yeah.
Tami, should we explain what we're talking about? Because we've suddenly gone into code.
Well, there's loads of code when it comes to Opline. I mean, that was part of the joy of it. But obviously, D was day of death. And then it was going to be D+1, D+2, and onwards. And the funeral will be on D+10. And these were dates kind of seared in my head. As it happened, the day of death became D-1 because an additional day got added into the whole schedule. And that was really kind of quite critical to the timetable. But yeah, that was probably my first thoughts. Where are we?
I must confess, when it came to D-1, I thought, oh, it's not 10 days, it's 11 or 12. And then I thought, oh, this is going to cost so much more than we thought it was going to cost. Because the reality is, as all the broadcasters in this room know, we're all really concerned. We're all under financial pressures. And I thought, oh my gosh, we've so carefully mapped out the costs, and a couple of extra days, oh no.
And I thought really differently, because I'd put a load of pieces together that were always in danger of being dropped because live stuff was going to happen. We always knew there was going to be a dynamic element to this. And I thought, an extra day, there's a chance it's going to get broadcast. Yeah.
You have a much more pure response than mine.
Talking of D+1, 2, 3, 4, 5, to the day of the funeral. You had to cover so many different angles, perspectives, different procedures, processes would have taken place to make sure you're covering somebody who's visited from abroad, somebody who's laying flowers, to the actual processions and the formal events that are taking place. What editorial decisions are you making on each day? And are you thinking, actually, yes, we want more voices on the ground, or we want more of the procession? How do you make those decisions?
I think you go along with events, don't you? So the queue was absolutely a massive story, wasn't it? With so many people being involved, which I think, you know, that brought many more voices out, which we used a lot. I think it's important as well, you talk about how big it was as well, to mention at this point that the broadcasters, Sky, BBC, ITV, we worked really closely together on this. And I personally feel it worked really well for that time, because it's such a ginormous story. There's so many things for us to cover. You talked about all the different processions, etc. We can't do it by ourselves. No broadcaster can. So everybody working together is really important at that stage, and I think that worked really well.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, because ITN is making the news for 3 different broadcasters, so they're all going to have their own different sort of editorial specifications. I think the important thing was about flexibility. You don't want to be too rigid in what your pre-planned packages and ideas are, because you want to be able to react to things like the queue. But I think, you know, broadly speaking, it was divided up between the ceremonial events and then news bulletins. And I think they had a different tone and a different role. I mean, it would be inappropriate, I think, to, start debating the role of the monarchy when you have the coffin of the monarch on the screen, as it was for hours and hours of that period. Whereas if you're then looking at, a Channel 4 news bulletin at 7 o'clock that evening, absolutely, one would want to hear a wider range of voices. So I think it was about kind of balancing more traditional news bulletins with the big ceremonial events.
And I think one other factor which I think impacts all of us now is that in addition to traditional broadcasts, as in morning news, breakfast news, evening news, lunchtime news, we now have, in NBC's case, we have a cable channel, MSNBC, which was wall-to-wall coverage. But we also have a streaming channel. And it was an interesting challenge. The streaming channel is relatively new. And I think we realized the tone is different, the audience is different. I shouldn't say the tone is different, because the tone has to remain appropriate, of course. But you're speaking to a different audience, and you are shaping coverage differently for each of these platforms. And it's a challenge, I think, that all broadcasters face going forward in a big event. You can't just put out the same thing. I mean, obviously, the moment of the funeral, you will all be on the same thing. But whether it's the cues, I would say for our streaming channel, we probably did a lot more coverage of people. We had to do possibly more explainers. So I think it's also working out which platform gets what kind of material and who's the best person to put that material together. It's a new challenge and it's tough.
And actually it kind of is a nod to social media. And how did social media play a role in this coverage? And how do you get that tone right? And also trust your presenters and reporters to get it right?
Look, social media is nothing new now. And I think I think for our presenters, for our correspondents, they are very used to knowing kind of where that line is. It's actually pretty well trodden. And with something as sensitive as the Queen, they get it. We didn't need to say anything to them. They got it.
But I think for us, what social media does do is it gives you real-time analytics of how your material is being viewed. I mean, we run a royal family channel, which is devoted to the royal family. And obviously this was a huge event for us. And I think because we could see, you get your geographical breakdown, you get your demographics about gender and age. And I think having that in real time and seeing the appetite was quite extraordinary, as well as being a bit of a dopamine hit, as you literally see the subscribers kind of racking up minute by minute. That's something we've not really had before in the same way for such a big event, to be able to get that kind of real-time feedback, and so that you can then that becomes actionable, that you can use some of that information. There was enough days for us to use it in how we kind of shape stuff going forward. But yeah, the appetite was absolutely massive.
And for us, I was just saying, putting a lot of material on social media hopefully was attracting a younger audience who may not have been watching elsewhere. So that's the other vital part of it for us. But there's also a lot of information, wasn't there, to impart to the public? How to get to London to see different events, there's just so much information to get over as well. And social media was another vital way of doing that.
Part of the rolling coverage is protocol and procedure. And with the Queen's journey from Balmoral to Buckingham Palace for the last time, lying in state, and the queue, and then King Charles's accession to the throne, it's a much rehearsed situation, but again, it requires a lot of logistics. And we have mentioned logistics, but give us an idea of how many people are involved and how such a big team then comes together to pull it all together and make it look so perfect on air.
WhatsApp.
Simple.
No, but seriously, we were reminiscing about the Chopper WhatsApp group, which was a cross-broadcaster WhatsApp group because when you think about it, so we were pooling the choppers, but a helicopter can only fly for a certain number of hours a day. And some days that was really obvious of what we needed to do because you're following the coffin or the route. But on other days, we needed cooperation between all of us. We've all got different priorities, things that we wanted to focus on, areas of the country we wanted to focus on, or bulletins, where we wanted it live. And I think that something like WhatsApp just allowed us to have that kind of very easy, very quick, fluid conversation. And frankly, I've got no idea how many people were involved.
No idea at all.
Is there ever, in terms of that WhatsApp, and everyone has a slightly different agenda and maybe want to be in a different place, how do you navigate that so that you all get what you want without there being any conflict? Because obviously you want it as seamless as possible and as quickly as possible.
On the whole, we all do want the same thing, don't we? Which is really important, I think. So I think it's quite obvious as well what people want, I think, is the main thing. And if there is any sort of debate between us, we just work it out, which we did do quite successfully.
Yeah, I mean, I think more than almost any other event I've ever worked on, it was incredibly collegiate across the board. And not just with the other broadcasters, but, believe it or not, within our own newsrooms as well. I think this was just an event where everyone realised that the way we would serve our own purposes best was by pulling together. And I know that sounds a little bit corny, but it really was the case. And so where there was disagreement, well, you've got another few days to work it out, and there has to be a bit of give and take. And on the whole, I think it was very, very cooperative.
I think that was all the more impressive on the fact that we were getting more and more tired, because we all worked pretty much. I didn't take a day off, and there were times down the run where I was speaking to colleagues, and we'd look at each other and we'd go, "Have we had this conversation?" Because we were so tired, and yet, what you're talking about is true. There wasn't that moment for me where I ever saw, people fly off the handle, which happens, where, things felt like they were falling apart, which happens. That didn't happen in this occasion through this run.
I was just thinking about your question about how many people were involved, and I suppose it's easier for me to quantify because we had people coming over from the States and we have a finite number of people based in London. So I would base it on how many credentials we ultimately had, and it was over 250, which is a lot. I will compare it to Kate and William's wedding, where we had 450 credentials. Different. I think times have changed, and we've also gotten more efficient with our coverage, and technology has changed. So once upon a time, maybe we were flying a lot of people over with a lot of equipment. These days, we have fibers instead of satellite trucks often. So I think that was a big part of the change. The other thing I will say is, I think we all knew, certainly everybody in our international operations and everybody based in London knew, all hands on deck. If you had a vacation plan, forget it. If you had a dinner plan, if you had a wedding anniversary, I suppose if you were getting married, you would be allowed to go. Maybe. But
Maybe.
yeah.
Maybe.
But really, and everybody knew, and everybody came in, and we knew this is the time where you must step up.
And in fact, when we actually did our rosters for the funeral day, a few people who we'd rostered off, either because they'd worked so many days in a row or because we needed them the next day, actually complained because they wanted to come in. You know, if you work in news, you want to be in a newsroom on the day of the Queen's funeral. So, yeah, it was a lot of people. And we brought in people from all over the organisation. You know, it wasn't just the news teams. There was quite a lot of sort of borrowing of people both from across ITN and other bits of ITV as well.
We actually doubled the size of our newsroom. We're currently in a temporary space that holds a certain number of people, and there's an atrium just next to it. And we built out the newsroom into the atrium so that people could go and sit there. And that's just in the building itself. The story was, out there.
Of course, there's no other major domestic news during that time, was there? Because so much other things closed down as a mark of respect. So you have a lot more resources available that way as well.
Tim, not to mention the tables that were laid out for the pizza.
They were, yes.
It was a very, very large food bill. I think if you ask the people paying the food bill how many people were working on Op Lion, they might be able to give you numbers.
Feeding people is half the battle, and then they're happy to keep going, aren't they?
There was quite a lot of good food, gotta say. It obviously all looked seamless on air. But there must have been things that went wrong. What's a standout moment for you that went wrong? John, I'll start with you because I'm sure none of you want to start first with this one.
Just pick up on your point a little bit earlier. I think it's about giving people a bit of a break, perhaps in those 10 days, just to pace people a bit more, because people just got really tired. No grumpiness, just people got really tired. So I think probably internally it's just thinking about how we give people breaks as well, so they're not working non-stop.
I think we ran into problems because we always assumed that the Premier League would suspend their matches for the weekend before. And in fact, so they ended up suspending their matches the weekend after the announcement, but not the weekend before, which meant there literally weren't enough trucks in the UK for the funeral day, because obviously they kind of were all in the wrong places. So it's not that it went wrong, but there was some massive reorganisation and reworking of the funeral day plan, which I don't think anyone wanted to live through ever again. And I think that was really, really challenging.
And a surprise, really, wasn't it? We didn't think about that.
Yeah.
I'm sure we had quite a lot of things go wrong, but I wouldn't want to talk about it.
I'm not going to talk out of turn here. The guy I'm going to talk about, I've checked that he's happy for me to share this. He's a guy called Jim Cathcart. He spent his career with us, started as a sound technician, and remembers back in 1980, the very first conversation had at ITN about a royal death, which was outside the Queen Mother's 80th birthday. And he'd seen the plans all the way through, had effectively retired, but was still part of our team coming back to join in London Bridge, and so was sitting next to me the night before the funeral. And you mentioned those pizza tables. Well, that day they had a particularly yucky looking pork and mashed potato that I ate, and Jim went and got his. And then I stood up and just walked through to the main part of the newsroom. I was in the atrium bit, and all of a sudden, one of our managers stood up and said, "Is there a first aider?" And we looked round, and Jim appeared to be having a heart attack right there in the newsroom. And suddenly it was that moment that you thought, oh my goodness, this is a guy who's only with us for this moment tomorrow, and it's all going wrong. And as people kind of worked to try and help, one of our news editors came up behind him, gave him the Heimlich maneuver, and he'd actually choked on a piece of pork.
Wow.
And spat it out and was fine.
So it didn't go wrong, it went right.
But that went wrong. It went right eventually.
I think that story also shows how big this is, how big that moment was, and how much bigger than us it was, that somebody had been there from that moment of just the thought of, what are we going to do when the Queen dies? To that actually happening. It was so much bigger than us, wasn't it? Yeah,
it really was, actually. Let me just, because I was I've been lucky enough in my travels to meet people who were involved in this project long before me. In fact, John, there's someone that I know who did your job before you. And so I was emailing afterwards. I couldn't email at the time, but afterwards. And I said, were you able to sit back and watch all this and, just enjoy it as a punter? Or were you one of those people who was just remembering the operational notes and kind of couldn't cope with it? And I got back an email that said, I'm afraid I fell into the camp of dredging up memories of planning notes long consigned to the back of my brain. Within 10 minutes, my wife said, I'm going into the other room if you're going to keep shouting at the TV. I was amused at the reaction of my old boss's wife. As he got into full flow from the sofa, his wife said to him, darling, they can't hear you. And what's more, I don't want to.
This is slightly off-piste perhaps, but in terms of how important it was and the scale and how much it meant to people everywhere. I remember I was briefly sent into Ukraine, and I was working with a very talented local producer, lawyer by training, who had a lot of difficult things happen in his family because of the war. And as I was leaving, he said, oh, you weren't here very long. And I said, no, I'm not really allowed to travel for long periods of time because, there are concerns about the Queen's health. And he said, are you worried? And I said, I'm always worried. And then he said, I don't know what I'll do when she dies. And, here's a 28-year-old Ukrainian lawyer who had lost so much, including family members. And, that was his response. And I thought, how incredibly poignant.
I mean, your life changed a bit personally, didn't it? You bought a Fitbit to make sure you had emails coming through. Apple Watch, sorry.
Yes, I was confessing earlier. So I was just always nervous. What if I'm somewhere and I don't get the call or, my phone is off? And I quite like going to the theater, but I started thinking, I can't go. What if it's Shakespeare and it's 3 hours? There's no way. I was at a show and I saw a man in front of me looking at his Apple Watch, and it was clear he was kind of checking for emails. And I thought, oh, what a cheeky fellow. How dare he? This is theater. Then I left and I thought, I'm going to get an Apple Watch. I traveled everywhere for the last 3 years with a hard copy of the funeral plans in my hand luggage. I didn't take long holidays. I took some, but I was quite, I would make sure that there were flights back. And every time my phone rang, either late at night or early in the morning, I would jump thinking, oh, is this it? And particularly in the last 6 months, I think we were probably all like that.
Yeah. I mean, I would say that the morning after she died, as my alarm went off at some ungodly hour and I hit it, I thought, wow, this is the first morning in months where my first thought has been, I wonder whether the Queen died overnight, or I wonder whether she's going to die today, because it's happened. And I think actually news people aren't brilliant at planning. I think we're really good at reacting and dealing with stuff. I personally found it really difficult living with that stress and that worry for so long. And I think actually once it happened, once it got going, there was a tremendous sense of, well, we've prepped for this and now it's working. And John and I were talking actually when we were reminiscing about helicopters, about one day when the helicopter couldn't fly because the weather wasn't great. Why don't you tell it?
It was, I think it was when the coffin come back to Norfolk, wasn't it? Before it was heading back to Buckingham Palace the night before. And the weather was really bad and the helicopter couldn't fly. We basically had like 2 hours to sort out something we normally could take days to sort out. We just got camera people lined up the whole way along the route, hotel receptions or hotel balconies along the route. And they just all us, BBC and ITV and Sky, we all got together, we all did different sections of it and did it all live back for everybody. And something that normally takes ages to plan, we just did on the hoof, and it was really poignant shots, weren't they? Do you remember?
Yeah, it was
the pouring rain coming as they're flowing flowers.
Yeah, and it was dark, it was raining, you had all the lights twinkling, and you had that kind of weird, quiet noise that you have when you have a lot of people, but they're all being quiet.
Yeah.
And I found that to be one of the most moving sections of it. And as John said, that was the bit that in a way was most done on the hoof. We didn't have a beautiful kind of helicopter to take us through it all. We all just had to kind of make it work
And
really
the policemen
quickly.
took off their hats, didn't they, as the coffee went
Yeah,
past. It was
it's
just
really
it was
special.
very spontaneous and done very, as I say, on the hoof. But I'm really glad the way it turned out. And our BBC One programme at the time, which was live on air, took it. Again, it's just an example of everybody clubbing together to make it work because it's a responsible time for our audiences.
Well, I'd like to add it's thanks to the brilliant UK coverage of all of the broadcasters that the world, all of your international partners, be it ZDF or, CBC or CTV, we all benefited from that because that material was shared. So it's honestly, without that kind of material, without the extraordinary coverage, both inside the Abbey of all the processions, the chopper shots, that's what made us able to tell the story to the United States, to our American audience. But really, those are images that went around the world to millions and millions of people.
We'd obviously had the death of Prince Philip about a year and a half before. Did that help in some way to prepare for this moment?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it gave us. I mean, to start with, you were talking about did you have the feels? Like, did you have the moment when the Queen died that you sort of shook? I did with Philip, and I didn't with the Queen. And I think it's because Philip had come along beforehand. That was personal. In the wider newsroom, it allowed us to see what was and wasn't going as well as could be. We talked earlier about WhatsApp and comms. We really looked into that after Philip. One of the things I found with Philip was I think I looked at my phone at one point and it was just popping. It was just popping and I couldn't read it all. It was just going. And we couldn't do that with the Queen at all. And we'd got to a place by the time the Queen died where that wasn't happening. So yes, it was a real way that we could learn and get better.
Yeah, I felt the same as well, just getting our communications better, which is what we did after that as well. But also, it was very different in its duration, wasn't it? Because of the 10 days afterwards and the events that happened after the death was very different as well. So it did feel quite different, though.
Yeah, and also we were still in a COVID world during Philip.
True.
I mean, I think when you were talking about other things which kind of worked in our favour, that actually we were pretty much out of COVID by the time it happened. Whereas with Philip, that was still a lot more of a consideration.
You also had to balance the fact that Prince Charles was taking on a new role as king. How do you balance that with the national state of mourning?
Whenever I would talk to lay people, ahead of this, I'd always have, and they'd take an interest in my job because I was full-time working on the Queen's death, and they'd say, "Oh right, okay, so the Queen's going to die," and I'd say, "Yes, and Charles will be king," and they'd take a moment, and I knew, or I felt, and my team felt that there were two stories here. There was a story that people emotionally were probably ready for, and there was a story that they were going to engage in, but they needed a bit of hand-holding with. It was important to say that Charles was immediately king. It was important to say that there wasn't going to be a coronation straight away. There was a lot of explaining that needed to be put there, and we saw that very much as part of what we needed to do.
We saw from our online stats a lot of interest in how the king becomes king and what happens next over the next 10 days. So that obviously fed a lot of our coverage as well.
I think it was interesting to me that that there was so much interest in Charles. I will have to add, though, there was perhaps more interest in Harry and Meghan. And would they be there? What would their role be? And I think that was, when you were talking about balance, I think we were very careful to make sure that our focus did remain on the Queen and King Charles, and that we didn't stray into the territory of, talking about Harry and Meghan too much and the rifts in the family, the brothers, the wives, and all that stuff, because it would be completely inappropriate.
It obviously was a once-in-a-lifetime event. So just to wrap up, I'd love to hear your reflections and how you would describe how you felt during Operation Lion.
Well, I mean, I'd always dreaded it. in that it was a genuine sleepless nights thing, in that I literally didn't sleep sometimes because I was worrying about it, or I'd wake up and I'd think about it, or, I found it was quite a heavy burden to shoulder, certainly in the months leading up to it. But in all my sleepless nights, what I never really considered, I always considered everything that could go wrong, but I never actually considered that it could be brilliant, that actually it could be a real high point of my career, that it would bring so many of the things that I've learned over all my time in news, both in terms of the relationships that I've built up with people and the knowledge I've had, that actually I could bring that all to bear in a 2-week period. And actually I came away from it feeling really, really proud of myself, proud of the team. I felt that it had been one of the most collegiate things I've ever done, both with my colleagues internally and with other broadcasters. So, yeah, ultimately it was a really positive thing and quite a privilege. Certainly being in the gallery on the day of the funeral, I think there is no better place than a gallery to watch a massive news event. And I was privileged to be in there, watching those beautiful pictures.
I totally agree. Proud, honoured to be a part of it, which is something that's such a huge moment in history for our country. Happy to be working, happy to not be away, because I think I would have been really annoyed myself if I wasn't around when it happened. And most importantly, just really proud of the team that are around me and how we all clubbed together and made it happen.
Relief. I think afterwards, certainly relief. And yes, a level of pride, and really quite pleased that the American audience had cared so much. And I felt that our programming was appropriate, tasteful, accurate. But again, relief, because like Tami, I had many sleepless nights and had worried about this for such a long time. And I remember at about D+5, when some of the major ceremonial events were happening, I took a moment, I stepped back and I thought, oh, this is working. Our 17 locations are up and running. Ultimately, we had 900 live shots and .com stories and streams. It was huge, the largest international story I think that we'd ever done. And so a sense that, wow, we collectively did this. We did it with the help of our UK broadcast partners, of course, but that, in situations like that, you do pull together with your partners, with your teams, and that kind of high of thinking of this ability to work together, because that's what news coverage really, in breaking news especially, is all about.
Yeah, I mean, I'd worked on this story for so long, and there were times where I remember going running with a friend a couple of months beforehand and going, and he said to me, "Your career's being held up by a 96-year-old woman." And I couldn't disagree, really.
Because you had spent basically the whole of lockdown.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I mean, at the start of lockdown, my wife was pregnant. And if you remember in lockdown 1, the advice was, shut up shop, throw away the key, do not pass go, do not go anywhere, and certainly don't go near a newsroom. So my boss, and wow, what a call, said, my job up to that point had been a split between doing regular bulletins and doing work on royal events. And he said, look, just focus on the royals, get ready. So I basically killed the Queen in my loft for 3 years. which was, an odd experience and quite isolating in some ways, knowing that one day there was going to be a moment that this mattered to everybody and really was important to everybody, but not that day, and not the next, and not the next. And so when it got there, I mean, I suddenly realized that it wasn't about me. It was about everybody else. It was about, the team that just clicked into gear. It was about the broadcasters that all just clicked into gear. It was about the eyes of the world that sort of suddenly shone. It was about the fact that the weather was unbelievably amazing. It was about the fact that, on and on and on it went. And it was just everything that I'd imagined playing out. And I just felt so privileged and so lucky to be there. And so pleased that I didn't take the advice of my friend to get another job. There's no right word for it, but that'll never, ever happen again.
I don't know, did any of you also, because we were all so busy in this period, I think after it was over, it suddenly dawned on me, oh, she's really gone.
And that's it. It's done. That moment that you've been waiting for, it's really happened. Well, thank you. I think that's a perfect note to end on. The fact that you all felt that privilege and have shared your feelings and experiences. So thank you so much for giving us an insight and sharing your reflections with us. Thank you to our panel, Tami, John, Kiko and Tim. A big thank you to our event sponsors, Timeline TV, and to the RTS London and RTS Technology, and to Kim for organising. And thank you all for coming out tonight.